welcome to CounterPunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in and coming back to the show. First-time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. If you're watching on CounterPunch Plus, thank you so much for the continued support. It's so appreciated. If you are listening to the audio, you're probably hearing this about a week or two later. Consider getting that subscription to CounterPunch Plus. All of this stuff is now going to be available on videos exclusively on CounterPunch Plus. There's also all of the content, all of the columns, Jeff St. Clair's stuff, all of the things that used to be in the print magazine. That's all still there. Plus features, in-depth analyses, cultural criticism, book reviews, a whole much more. Please do consider getting that subscription and supporting what we do. Now, one of the ways that you can support CounterPunch is by getting a subscription, and another way is by supporting our friends. And one of the friends of CounterPunch that I really do recommend you support is JP Sottile. He is the Newsvandal. Newsvandal.com is the website. There is no one anywhere that I know of that does better news curation than JP. The newsletter is essential every single day. JP, welcome back to CounterPunch.
Good to be with you, Eric.
You're the man. You're dressed like a gonzo journalist, just ready to get down with your somewhat Bill Paxton looking grin on your face. I like it. JP, I want to ask you something real quick here. This infrastructure bill, it's about to be passed. I don't want to get into all of the details, but I want to ask you, broadly speaking, tell me about the political implications. What should we understand about what this bill really means now and moving forward?
Well, this is going to be Biden's big victory, or at least his big victory, not necessarily for building back better, but as a proof of concept that Republicans and Democrats can work together to get something done, this idea of bipartisanship. And this is an idea that's causing a lot of problems inside his own party between moderates and progressives. But this is, I think, designed to be the victory lap that they want to run going into next year's off-year elections, particularly in those 20 Senate seats. Now, obviously, not all 20 Senate seats, but there are two in particular, Iowa and Pennsylvania. Those are the ones I'm looking at, Toomey and Grassley. And I think that the Democrats think they might be able to pick those up. And how do you pick those up? By appealing to Iowa's voters I think they would find the bipartisanship appealing, and then the suburbs around Pennsylvania, where you have to carry those suburbs to get the Senate seat. Now, that will also be complicated by the candidates, because then you have John Fetterman potentially running in Pennsylvania, and Fetterman, in a weird kind of way, kind of matches, although he's very progressive on a number of issues. He also matches that idea of reaching across to non-traditional Democrats, to maybe to independents and Republicans, at least with his Carhartt wearing sort of persona. So, there is a tactical and there's a tactical reason for doing the bill the way they're doing it and breaking off the human infrastructure part that's supposed to follow. That's the progressive goodie bag of maybe $2.5 to $3 trillion that they want to do in reconciliation after this bill gets passed. That's the tactical. I think the strategic is the political angle, which is trying to also bulwark Democrats against the onslaught that's going to come in the House races, because I think the House is where the Democrats could be in trouble if the Republicans, that playbook of fear and loathing, to sort of play variations on the theme from this call, that they have used so well. And it's going to be immigration, crime, and critical race theory. That's what they're going to run on. So what do? Well, while they're talking about those things, we are doing what? We're building roads and bridges and we're not even building roads and bridges. We're building bridges to moderate Republicans who are exiles in their own party. At least I think that's what they're trying to do. Whether it's going to work is another story.
And in the meantime, what happens to the Democrats? Because, realistically, this is as powerful as they're going to be.
Right. I mean, unless something amazing happens in the Senate, Warnock is going to have a challenge. I don't know if Herschel Walker is the guy to beat him. So what if they lose Georgia, which is a possibility, particularly with all the new restrictions that are coming in, voter restrictions and purges? and they do end up picking up Pennsylvania and somehow pick up Iowa if Grassley decides not to run, or if Grassley runs and runs a bad campaign and they have a good candidate. Still, they're only up to 51, so you're still in the same filibuster conundrum that you were prior to. So, you know, then what are you doing? You're playing for 2 years after, for the 2 years after that, which is the presidential election, which I just, I don't even, I think I'm going to tap out before that. I have to be honest, Eric. I don't know if I want to go through that next presidential cycle
The
with
other
what would be a lame duck presidency and a
nightmare.
metastasizing political culture.
Nightmare. But before we can address that nightmare, it seems to me that the Democrats basically more or less are stuck between a rock and a hard place here, aren't they? Because they're basically saved all of their bullets to shoot down the onslaught from their left. Right. I mean, it seems like they've expended a tremendous amount of energy suppressing a lot of the left. Right. We saw that in this special election in Ohio very recently, where tremendous firepower was used, big guns brought out to bring down Nina Turner. So talk to me a little bit about the internal conflicts inside of the Democratic Party and how that might potentially spill over into these election results.
Well, it's it's been there since 2016. It's been there since it's been there for a long time. It's actually been there in some ways since Occupy Wall Street. And there were a lot of people who were very unhappy with the Obama presidency after those 8 years were up. A lot of progressives who were very unhappy, and so that fissure has not been necessarily healed. In a weird way, it was kind of papered over by hatred for Donald Trump and the desire to get rid of Donald Trump, which makes all the sense in the world. I mean, that was completely logical. But there are actually a number of ways in which I think Biden's presidency is sneaky progressive. I would say this child tax credit that's being implemented is really another way of doing UBI. It's basically UBI for a huge chunk of the population earning under $50,000 a year. So there are a number, the expansion of Medicaid. Those are all very good, solid, progressive ideas. It's not Medicare for all, obviously, and the wish list is not going to be met. But ultimately, you got to win elections, and I think whatever fissures there are in the Democratic Party come up against the reality that Donald Trump got over 70 million votes. And there are a lot of people in this country that respond to Tucker Carlson fawning over Viktor Orban, and they respond to the critical race theory dog whistles. Fox News is doing really, really well right now, while MSNBC and CNN are declining in ratings. Newsmax's that blip is over, but Fox News just won in all 13 key demographics on Wednesday. They just swept the ratings. Still, we're talking about 5 to 8 million people, but in the age of micro-targeted elections, in which elections can be won on a precinct by precinct level by using social media to drive votes, that 8 million people is a significant number of people. And I don't know how the Democrats square this circle of making the transition generationally between the older voters who like the idea of Joe Biden saying, "Oh, we're getting back to business and we're working with Republicans and the Senate's working like it used to back when I used to sit side by side with Strom Thurmond and laugh and backslap, and we used to get things done during the Cold War." And the younger generation, which has progressive aspirations, wants to implement those aspirations and elect people like Nina Turner. And then Nina Turner gets there and she runs up against the buzzsaw, as you said, of Shontel Brown, who is backed by a lot of establishment money and also backed by a generational divide in the Jewish vote in Cleveland, which came out to support Shontel Brown. But as you and I were talking off air before we came on the air here, that Jewish vote mimics the generational divide within the Democratic Party of the older voters who are reliable voters who will come out to vote in a primary election, and the younger voters who who supported Nina Turner and were okay with her pro BDS point of view, but didn't show up to vote. So, you know, until younger voters show up to vote in greater numbers than older voters, the Democratic Party is still going to have to find a way to keep this thing together. Because if they don't, then you open the door to basically a minority party, which is what the Republicans are, being in charge of the government.
Yeah, well, that's where we're headed. And another reason why we're headed there is the messaging and the narratives. And I think the Democrats do have a tremendous problem here, despite the fact that they're a right-wing reactionary capitalist party, as we all know here at Counterpunch. In the broader American public, it is not quite seen that way. And the Democrats have a very significant problem because now the issue of crime and so-called law and order is no longer just Donald Trump's, sort of racist dog whistle, right? Crime is becoming a very real problem. You're seeing it more and more, even if it's not reflected in the macro statistics on the broader, decade to decade scale. We're definitely seeing a spike. You see it every day on the news in New York City, another shooting in Queens, 10 people injured, another shooting, in the Bronx, whatever it might be. And the reality is that crime is going to become more of a political issue this time, and it will, of course, dovetail with all of the other racist dog whistles like critical race theory and the others, right? So it's not that the Democrats are the party of defund the police. They're not. That's absurd. But they're going to be painted as such. And so my question is, how exactly are the Democrats going to fight back against this sort of multi-pronged sort of pincer maneuver here?
Yeah, good luck. How have they fought back against it since Nixon? I mean, this is
I guess it was a rhetorical question.
Right. I mean,
more than
it's just
anything.
it's just gone on and on. And you're right. The thing about crime is that it doesn't have to be an aggregate reality. It can be an anecdotal reality. And anecdotally, it just has huge impact electorally. It always has. And it's, I'm here in the Bay Area. Crime is it's a constant in the news here, in the news coverage. And it dovetails with immigration, and somehow it dovetails with the argument that Democrats are socialists, because socialists, as you know, want to defund the police, and it just kind of proves that they're socialists because the Democrats are socialist. And anybody who knows anything about anything knows that the Democrats really aren't socialists.
JP, I guess now is a good opportunity for me to take a pause here and step back and have you explain to us the history of how we got here, because you are the man who encapsulates this history better than anyone I know. How we got to this point where Democrat equal and liberal equals soft, panty-waist little pussy boy who is weak, and Republican conservative equals strong and backbone. And how did we get here? And how did we get to the point where crime is sort of a product of the Democrat?
It's so interesting. I think about my life. I was born in 1968. And somehow I just kind of was there for the creation. I was born into it, and I just watched it. As I grew up, I watched it grow up side by side with me in the popular culture and in politics. The crucial year is, of course, 1980 and Reagan's election. Everybody knows about Law and Order and Nixon and him running on that twice, and to great effect. But the Republicans, who are so incredible at messaging and always have been in my entire life, and we're talking about messaging here tonight again, how are the Democrats going to deal with messaging? In the 80s, Reagan and the Reagan Revolution and Reagan Republicans, one of the sort of genius moves that they made was to turn the term liberal into an epithet. And it was an epithet that was associated with being soft on communism, soft on crime, soft on sexual deviancy, soft on immorality, soft on the decline of the family, on teen pregnancy, on drug use. You name it, that's what it came to be associated with, being liberal in the most general sort of Webster dictionary sense, liberally allowing people to engage in all kinds of Sodom and Gomorrah activities that are led to the decline of Western civilization. As a matter of fact, Robert Bork, who was going to be sort of a crowning achievement of the right wing on when he was nominated to the Supreme Court, wrote a book called Slouching Towards Gomorrah. And the slouching is because of liberals and liberal policies. It's about creating welfare queens when that was actually never really happened. There was one woman who was engaged in welfare fraud in Chicago in the late 70s, turned into welfare queens, and it turned into this idea that liberal policies, what they do is they take inner city youth and they turn them into these baby factories that pump out criminals that are given license to go, and not just license to go, they're given weekend passes by Michael Dukakis to go out and rape white women and kill the white woman's husband. And then that's the future for America that the Democrats as liberals are postulating, one in which the family is destroyed, Western civilization is compromised, crime is rife, and the criminals are given money from you, hardworking American Joe, who just wants to, have a dog and a wife and 2 kids and a big truck. Your hard work is going to do what? It's going to create income that's going to be taken by the government, and that government's going to give it to welfare queens and the criminals that she produces. That's by, Dukakis was up, I think, 19 points coming out of the Democratic election in 1988. Dukakis, who was motivated, he said in interviews, he was motivated to run by watching Iran-Contra. And, we forget what an amazing Titanic mess Iran-Contra was. It might be the most incredible scandal of the modern era. Because it leads to other things like BCCI and Iraqgate that have also been overlooked. But he was going to go in and clean house. He was a technocrat. He was a guy who was famous for getting on the bus and riding the bus to work every day. I mean, he was known as a straight shooter. And George Herbert Walker Bush had his fingerprints all over Iran-Contra. Well, the only way they were going to beat Dukakis was using this old playbook that started with Nixon, was honed and perfected by Reagan, and then metastasized, I think I've used that twice tonight, metastasized by Lee Atwater, and it became Willie Horton and the Pledge of Allegiance. People forget about it. Willie Horton was a big part of that campaign, but so was the Pledge of Allegiance. That Dukakis was against the Pledge of Allegiance. You mean against kneeling for the flag? Sounds familiar.
And JP, it's so, I appreciate the way that you sort of drawing out the picture for us. And I just as a sort of, to draw that out even further, there is that international parallel, because to the extent that they would be soft on crime, soft on the Black community, soft on the welfare queens, they are also soft on the Soviets, right? They are détentistes, right? These are the people around Carter, the trilateralists, right? The Brzezinskiites, and so forth, right? So the Reagan, the Paul Nitzes and the committees from the 1950s, all of these Cold warriors that were around the Reagan administration, they sort of transformed their sort of détentist enemies into these weaklings on an international scale, similar to how they did to their sort of liberal Democrats on the domestic front.
That's right. And so the liberal Democrats on the domestic front are actually aiding and abetting an international communist conspiracy, whether they're doing it knowingly or they're just
like today, JP, exactly. Biden and the Communist Party of China, right? It's it's exactly the same concept.
Same thing. And that's why that socialism tag works. It drives people nuts on the left. I know it drives people nuts, but it works. I personally have, I know some people who live in that ecosphere or know people that live in that ecosphere. And I get into conversations with them and I constantly have to tell them, these are people who are on Medicare and Social Security. And it's like, that's kind of socialism. I mean, what you're angry about, well, that's not socialism, but we live in an environment in which Fox News in the middle of the day can run an ad that features Joe Namath pitching a Medicare and Social Security supplement program. And he's saying, get what you're entitled to out of Social Security and Medicare. Get what you're entitled to out of Social Security. He keeps saying it over and over. And I'm like, hello, these people are watching this, and then they're going to go out. It's going to come out of the commercial and go straight to Fox News, pitching them on how socialism is evil.
Right, but I mean, we can't forget, JP. A huge chunk of America are complete fucking morons. Don't forget that. That's a key aspect of all of this. The elephant in the room, really.
I hate to say it. I really do hate to say it because I don't want to foreclose on anybody in the country. But we do have a representative democracy. As much as people feel like our democracy does not represent the American people, it does. I actually think Donald Trump was the most representative our president we've ever had. I mean, he represents so much.
Hard to disagree.
So, when I get in debates with people, progressives, about things like the Nina Turner Chantel Brown election, I say to them, I kind of have to evoke a little Don Rumsfeld. You go to war with the army you have, right? Remember he said that, the army that we had, why were you ill prepared for Iraq? Well, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. And we're going into elections with the electorate we have. And I think one of the reasons why Biden is even here in the presidency and cutting these deals is because there is some utility in continuing to play the moderate game with a population that you have to deprogram on a continual basis if you want to turn them into voters. Now, the other idea is to say, well, forget about them as voters. But the problem is that the independents who actually decide all the elections are more fluid than that. Now, they are over time trending more, certainly socially progressive, economically progressive, not as quickly, not as far, although I think the healthcare issue is changing a lot. I've seen a lot of change on climate change. I see a lot of these issues evolving. It's just that there's a lag time between the aspirations of progressives in the Democratic Party and the realities of the electorate that comes out to vote reliably, particularly in primaries.
Before we take a quick break, I want to just quickly ask you whether you think that what Cori Bush did with regard to the moratorium on evictions, is this going to ultimately make her a liability? Are they going to make her into the next AOC because they're going to make her into this sort of banner for what the far left socialists and whatever, far left radical agenda and all of this stuff? Because I mean, I read a whole think piece about it. I'm sure there were several think pieces about it by several people who consider themselves smart, but I don't really kind of buy it, just because I don't really think that the Republicans need that in order to drive home that point. I don't think that she does anything that AOC or Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar didn't already do for them. So that's right. I'm sort of not really buying that there's some kind of
force multiplier
backlash
effect, right? There's going to be a force now that Cori Bush, well, now right. It's going to, now it's a slam dunk.
I don't really buy it. No, I don't really buy it. But do you think? But okay,
I think the problem for them on the eviction moratorium is that Biden, when he talked about it in a presser earlier this week, said, well, everybody I'm talking to, or almost everybody, is saying it's unconstitutional. And it's not going to pass muster. He said muster a number of times, constitutional muster, but we're going to do it anyway because while it's being litigated, it'll buy a couple months' time. Now that's a very shrewd, practical policy way to approach it. You just don't say that publicly. You know what I mean? You don't say publicly, well, this is going to be unconstitutional. I mean, it's going to get fought in the courts, but in that, we're going to buy people 2 months of time while it's being fought in the courts. And until it's finally deemed again unconstitutional, we'll get 2 months of people not being evicted. What you do is you say, well, I think it's going to pass constitutional muster. And then when it doesn't, you end up saying, you go, oh, I'm surprised. I'm really disappointed with the decision, because you want to know what? That's exactly how the Republicans would have played it. That's exactly how the Republicans would have played it. They would have said, they would have known that it was a bogus argument. They would have pushed it anyway. They would have let it gone through the courts, and whatever it was they were trying to buy, which would have been billions more in oil subsidies or whatever they were trying to push through, they would have achieved their policy end without exposing themselves so badly politically.
All right, let's take a quick break. On this side of the break, lots more to talk about with JP. Let's get more depressing. What do you think, JP? You want to get more depressing?
You know, I'm always going to embrace.
Oh, okay. All right, pour yourself another drink. Everybody, pour yourselves another drink. Take a listen to the music. We'll be right back. And we are back on CounterPunch Radio, CounterPunch Plus. If you're watching the video, thank you so much for the continued support. If you're not yet a subscriber, please go to the website and do that. Very much appreciate that. All right, JP, I want to talk about a couple of other things with you, and I'm going to ask you the most general question you could ever imagine, and you know where I'm going to go with this, but just riff with me for a second. JP, do we live on a toxic planet?
You know, I do the rundown, and if you don't get the rundown, what I do is I get up in the morning. I get up at 3:30, sometimes 4, and I go to hundreds of websites every week, and I collect hundreds and hundreds of stories. And you know, every once in a while, at least once a week, I try and top the leads with a climate story or an environment story. And when you spend as much time as I have over the last 10 years looking at story after story after story about the environment, about climate change, and about plastic, about PFAS, about forever chemicals, about pesticides and herbicides, it is undeniable that we are taking the whole damn planet with us. I mean, at every level, the microplastics are now showing up in fish, at the cellular level in fish. We're eating the fish. We're breathing the plastic. We're breathing particulate pollution. You know, yes, we live on a toxic planet. And I think the toxicity is actually not just physical and ecological. I think that toxicity is transferring into our politics, into our society, and into our culture.
Well, let's expand a little bit on that. When you say things like microplastics and forever chemicals, maybe you could define what those things are and how they relate to this idea of this sort of toxic planet. Because I know that this is not, and just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that this is like, you know, my unique thought or your unique thought. The people are writing books on the idea that we're living on a toxic planet. I was just reading about this the other day, right? The idea that quite literally every system on the planet is so thoroughly polluted in various ways that essentially everything has already been spoiled and is continuing to be spoiled on a daily basis, right? So there was studies showing the percent of land that's been tainted by fertilizers, the percent of land that's, you know, absorbed these various runoffs and things like that. What happens when they get into the groundwater and how many square miles per, you know what I mean? Like all kinds of insane statistics that lead you to this very dark thought that like, is everything fucked already, JP?
Yeah. I mean, short answer, yes. You know, microplastics are showing up in alpine regions, in alpine lakes. They're showing up in snow, in places where you would think no human has really been here with plastics. Well, plastics, as they continue to break down, they're being carried on the wind. They're being carried on the tides. They're being carried all over the place without human beings, because they're breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces, and some of those pieces are respirable, breathable. It's, you know, one of the things that forever chemicals, PFAS, these are things made by Dow and 3M in particular. A lot of these things are made to make other things. Some is used as coolants, as for viscosity and machinery, all kinds of processes. And these forever chemicals, they're called forever chemicals because they don't really break down. I mean, we used to go off about radioactive waste and radioactive half-life. I mean, microplastics is just like radioactive waste, but maybe even worse because what's the half-life on it? I mean, unless you get some microbes, and that there is some progress in finding microbes that can eat plastic and process it. But if you start unleashing hundreds and thousands of microbe varieties to try and destroy plastic, are you then creating another cascading problem, ecological problem of unintended consequences? Because this is one of the problems with remediating all of this toxicity, is that there are unintended consequences that we don't know about in some of these remediation efforts. So these forever chemicals, they're in water, they're in our bodies. They're in our bodies. We all have them in our bodies, forever chemicals, all of us, right now, all of us. We all have plastics in our bodies right now. I mean, I haven't bought bottled water now. I think it's been 16 or 17 years. I will go without water if it means not drinking bottled water. And one of the funny things, I love to do this too. You go to somebody's house, you want some water? And I'm like, sure. And I go, yeah, get a glass. Okay, get a glass. And I go to the tap and I get tap water, and people, oh, no, don't drink that. Don't drink that. I'm like, why? Well, here's a bottle. No, I'm going to take the tap. I will take the tap over your bottled water because it has BPA and it's we have endocrine disrupting chemicals that are leaching into all of our food. Anyway, so the Anthropocene is here. The whole planet is a crime scene, the Anthropocene of the crime, and we have radically altered the entire system. The question is how and what can we remediate it, and what can we remediate? What can't we remediate? We spend a lot of time on climate change, but what we are discovering is that automobiles are not just heating up the planet, they're actually destroying our brains. How are they destroying our brains? Well, you could say they're destroying our brains by making us buy gigantic trucks that are now the size of semis, but in spending $100,000 on a Ford F-150 that's lifted 15 feet, that's kind of destroying your brain. But no, it's now being linked to dementia and Alzheimer's, because what happens? Well, oddly enough, we've cleaned up some of the odor and smogginess of automobile exhaust. And that has made us acutely unaware of the fact that we are still breathing automobile exhaust, even though it doesn't smell like it did. Now, I'm in California. We have the cleanest exhaust on the planet. Hooray for California. You go to Oregon, all of a sudden you go, man, I could tell I'm driving in Oregon because I can smell the car in front of me. You're still getting a lot of what you're getting in Oregon here in California. And what you're getting is small particulate matter that is actually ending up in the brain and causing potentially brain damage, loss of IQ, and is being linked over and over again with dementia. I've seen over the last 5 years repeatedly articles linking it to dementia. So the question I have is, so if we have dementia, we have cancer, we have ADHD, we have ADD, we have an autism epidemic. Maybe the autism is not because of vaccinations. Maybe it's because we live in a toxic chemical soup all the time, and we don't even know what the cocktail effects, in the United States, I'm going off here. In the United States, if you have a chemical product, the EPA, the FDA, the government has to prove that it is unsafe. In Europe, you have to prove that it's safe. Here, you have to prove that it's unsafe. And one of the ways that you prove that it's safe or unsafe in the United States is you do a 1-to-1 test. So here I have chemical X. I'm going to see if chemical X produces problem Y. If chemical X does not produce problem Y, it's good to go. And we're going to do it at a micro level. So it's not even going to be a significant level, but because we want to get through the process. But what if chemical X and chemical Z together cause problem Y? Well, we don't test the two of them together, the cocktail effect. That's actually something that's starting to be done in Europe. That's not being done here. And we live in a toxic chemical soup, a cocktail of different chemicals. And we're not paying attention to it. We're blithely ignorant to it. And that's just for us. Think about the other creatures on the planet who don't have the bodies that we have, don't have the awareness we have. They're the innocent bystanders. We're wondering why all the birds are dying in the East Coast. We're starting to understand why bees are dying. Well, because we put them in a toxic chemical soup. And that toxicity is building and building and building. And I think just to finish up this rambling thought, we are about, so the Green Revolution happens after World War II. And the Green Revolution is a petrochemical revolution. Petrochemicals create pesticides, petrochemicals create plastics, petrochemicals create the energy and the power to engage in the Green Revolution, which the Green Revolution is the massive increase in industrial scale agriculture. And they also create the nitrogen-based fertilizers. So we're not even using natural fertilizers, we're using petrochemical-based fertilizers. It's all part of the empire of oil, all cogs in it. Our use of these chemicals, this green revolution, in concert with our massive increase in oil-driven industrialization and the massive growth in the number of cars, is all, 75 years? We're 75 years into this. Look at how fast climate change is accelerating, and just project that, how fast the accelerant is in this realm of pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides in the natural world, chemicals that we are exposing ourselves. We are kind of coming to a critical mass moment on all of these things. And it's really traces back to one thing, the empire of oil. These are all outgrowths of oil, microplastics, oil, pesticides, oil, nitrogen-based fertilizers, oil. Everything is oil, and we are swimming in the toxic soup that comes from the empire of oil that the United States built over the last 70 years.
JP, I want you to talk about. I want you to talk about.
Sorry about that.
No. Please. Do you need a moment? Do you want to?
Yeah, it's it's frustrating to me that we talked about this being a representative government. That as much as we like to say it's the politicians and the corporations, it's really us. I mean, it's really us. The argument about climate change in China is one that I get a kick in the pants out of, right? We can't do anything about climate change because look at China. China is this biggest emitter. They're bigger emitter than us. And if we unilaterally disarm, like the pansy liberals we are, like they were going to unilaterally disarm in the 70s and the 80s, which is one of the reasons that Reagan came to power to unilaterally rearm. If we unilaterally disarm against the Chinese, it's going to be fundamentally unfair to the American people. Well, if you look at China's climate change impact, it's traced directly to American consumers in Walmart. China's climate impact would not be there if America was not buying plastic landfill fodder that was made in China, plastic that was made with oil. And who has been the number one guarantor of the oil industrial complex? It's the United States. It's the United States, the American people who have supported the oil empire of oil, who gladly drive the cars, who gladly buy the plastic, who have really no remorse about what was done to Iraq, which was all about yes, it actually was about oil. It was about keeping their oil in the ground because the Saudis, who are our partner in the empire of oil, wanted to make sure that oil didn't come on the market. That's my belief. We can argue the fine points of that one way or another, but fundamentally, our entire way of life, our entire standard of living, everything that we buy, everything that we do is tied into this empire that was constructed in the wake of World War II. And what we did with this moment of triumph, of defeating fascism, of ending the Holocaust, coming back to a nation that was bulwarked by a new union-driven working class, FDR-driven, a New Deal codified working class. And what did we do? We built the empire of oil. We killed millions of people, and we've despoiled the planet. And now when it comes time to do something about it, how are we going about embracing it? Well, Biden this week launched his new EV effort, right? Electric vehicles. And what is that EV effort? It's basically just a feel good PR move. 50% of the cars by 2030 are going to be EVs. Okay, well that's great. Ford uh, and and GM, they're on board. That's great. That's fine. But you want to know what it is? It's a target. It's not an actual goal. It's a target. We hope we get there. And oh, by the way, the EVs, ultimately they're great in terms of carbon, but they're not great on other things. They're not great on rare earths. They're not great on mining. They're not great on how you dispose with the batteries once they're made. So there's a price to pay for everything. But fundamentally, why are we challenging the idea that we all have to have we have to have a car manufacturing based economy in the first place? But that's a conversation we don't want to have, because it means changing the way that we live, and that's something we don't want to do.
Well, JP, it's a conversation that I do want to have. So I want to play it out a little bit further,
Sure.
what you were just saying. Okay. So taking this historical scale that you're kind of alluding to, 75 or so years, it probably is actually more than that if you really want to be specific, but whatever, in the
Yeah, but I think
post-war,
after World War II is when it
right.
really kicks in.
So there is an argument to be made that the broader political divisions that we've seen, especially in the last 5 years, really are at their root an expression, the political expression of the divide within the ruling class in the empire, in the United States, a divide that essentially could be boiled down to use your terminology, that segment of the ruling class that wants to cling to the empire as it exists with this oil-based kind of petrochemical, oil-driven imperial system, versus those segments of the ruling class that are not only not as tied to that as their counterparts, but who, for various reasons, most of which are self-interested but not exclusively, do recognize the need to transform the nature of the empire and to shift the I wouldn't say mode of production, because it still remains capitalism, but I mean to say to shift the sort of engine of the global capitalist system that is headed by the United States and its imperial tentacles. And so, like, Jeff Bezos is a good example, right? Elon Musk, or whomever you want to point to, right? These guys are doing things that are absolutely, I think, in the spirit of transforming the empire for the 21st century, right? Amazon or SpaceX or whatever you want to, however you want to look at it. There's a reason why they can see themselves as pioneers for a green future, for an eco-friendly future, right? Because in their minds, what they're doing is they're pushing the empire forward, aren't they?
Well, I think in terms of Elon Musk and Bezos, I don't really see them pushing for a green future at all. I think they're pushing for an escape hatch.
Well, but in the popular imagination, it amounts to the same thing, because Jeff Bezos comes back from fucking outer space and says we need to move all dirty industry off of the planet because we're ruining the planet, right? I mean, he says that, but he's an idiot, but that's beside the point. He says that because there is an indicator of uh, a certain kind of consciousness within the ruling elite, I think. Those who are comfortable in Silicon Valley or in Beverly Hills or whatever, among the sort of smoothie drinking, yoga performing, liberal class, right? These people also understand what climate change is. They're not completely foolish.
So on Bezos, have you been behind a Amazon box truck lately? They have this wonderful slogan. It says, "There's more to Prime, a truckload more." A truckload more. Is a truckload more really what we need? So I've noticed now that Amazon has gone to a sort of a greener packaging over the last couple months, and they're doing whatever they can to make PR greenwashing moves to make it seem like they're part of the future. Fundamentally, they're part of this supply chain of of acquiring landfill fodder and delivering it to you so that you can have it in your hands for a year or two before you put it in the trash and it goes into the landfill. So fundamentally, you know, I I think Bezos and Musk are not quite as good
Well, no,
cast
I
as
mean, I
well
picked
as
them.
I see it as sort of the
I
Carol
picked them because
Quigley-ites
their
and Leo
personalities.
Straussians, right? This traditional divide among the
Well,
elites.
why don't you get a little more obscure for our
I'm
audience,
sorry,
JP?
but
Come on.
because I would say Bill Clinton is a good example of that divide, and Obama is a good example of that divide. There you have the hardcore empire of oil folks, and then you have that establishment in the Democratic Party that has over the last 15 to 20 years in the post-Clinton years, Bill Clinton years, not Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton years, because Bill Clinton is when Dukakis loses and then Bill Clinton comes in on the heels of Dukakis, right? Because Dukakis's loss is that leads to the
You're
to the
the
Demo-
only person. You're the only person who can do an interview and bring up Dukakis in three different unrelated contexts. The only person I know who can do that is
the
you.
Democratic Leadership Council, right? That's the failure of traditional liberalism is what leads to Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton was an idea of, in a way, he was the kinder, gentler empire version of the
But this is
Democratic Party, right?
the, this is the divide we see over and over again. We already brought it
Yeah,
up. I'll bring it up
yeah,
again, right? The Cold Warrior hawks versus the Brzezinski style trilateralites, right? These people who saw imperialism and US imperialism being furthered through things like globalization of capital, right? Cooperation with China, right? Opening up business relations as a means of expanding imperial control, right? That was Brzezinski's whole
yeah.
concept, was that you don't fight wars to expand the empire. You expand the empire through these various, through these various financial leverage and so forth, right?
And it
So,
would be nice to have Afghanistan.
right. Well,
I
that's a
mean,
different
it would
issue, but
also be nice to have Afghanistan.
sure. Well,
I mean,
so many
if you
have
look at
said
the
that, haven't they?
chessboard,
But I bring that up only to say that again, you've seen over and over again the divides within the ruling class as to what the nature of the empire is and what it should be. And I think that we're seeing that again, right? As you and I have discussed over the last 5 years, countless times.
yeah,
Trump represents the dirtiest and heaviest of the industries, right? He represents the worst of the worst when it comes to the polluters, when it comes to the dirtiest industries. And there's a reason why they grouped around him, why they clung to him, why they saw him as a lifeline. And it's not just because he's dirty and he likes to pollute the planet because he's a fucking monster, even though he is, right? But it's also because of the nature of how they view US power.
that's right. Intimately intertwined with the empire, with oil. That's what the empire of oil is all about for them. I mean, it's so the guy who I think fits your character, if you're casting a character, is Bill Gates more than Bezos and Musk, because Bill Gates is a guy who
Yeah,
thinks that
I agree.
technology is
Gates
going to
is the
solve
better
all
one.
the problems. He's basically liberal. He's socially liberal. He seems to be behind liberal causes. He seems to be broad-minded in a lot of ways, but he thinks that nuclear power could be an answer. He thinks that you can use technology to to basically work yourself through this troublesome patch that we're in, and eventually technology will fix everything. I'm kind of a mind that, I'm not sure piling more technology and more unintended consequences on top of the giant pile of toxic unintended consequences we've created over the last 75 to 100 years is the way to go, because it seems to me that what we're faced with is a radical reevaluation of how we live our lives and what the predicates of our aesthetics are, what makes for a good life. And actually, I think that this is one of the reasons why Trump was so successful, is because not only was gave he was like a giant Trojan horse where all of the oil and petrochemical and pesticide and all the lobbyists piled into him and actually became part of his administration. But also he gave voice to that toxic political feeling of his supporters that their way of life was coming to an end and that he was going to fight for their way of life, that the way of life that was as American as apple pie and Chevrolet, right? As American as apple pie and Chevrolet, because Chevrolet is a big part of that way of life, that we're all going to have cars and homes and we're all going to be we're going to be this wonderful white nuclear family from the 50s. And that way of life is imperiled by things like immigration. Well, what is immigration being driven by? And more the evidence is that climate is a big part of what's driving immigration. So
U.S. foreign policy
and U.S. foreign
Latin
policy.
America
And what is U.S. foreign policy in Latin America? If you don't think it's about oil, you're wrong. It's also about oil. So
and real estate and a thousand other, of course,
100%. So this empire has created all of these byproducts, and these byproducts now are washing up on our shores, and people are freaking out, and they want it to go away. And Donald Trump was a guy who says, "Don't worry about it. I can make it go away, right? I alone can fix it." But I think that what we're seeing is politically, and not just here, I think it's something globally, because this is not just happening in the United States. This is happening with Modi in India. This is happening in Eastern Europe. This is happening all over the place. I do feel that as toxic as the planet has become, what is it, like 60 or 70% of the fauna has disappeared since 1970? Since 1970? I mean, think of the mass amounts of death that you have to produce to get rid of 60, 70% of the fauna. I think that we feel it in our bones. I think that we sense it in our daily lives. I think that and now that the news cycle has been hijacked, appropriately so, by wildfires, by droughts, now that farmers in the Midwest, farmers in Colorado, farmers all over the world are feeling the impacts of climate change, now that the chickens are finally coming home to roost, I think what we are doing is we are reacting with a garrison state mentality. At least many of us are. The idea that we need to get on the walls and we need to protect what little we have because we are in an environment of rapidly shrinking possibilities and meaning resources. And that's the moment at which we're either going to engage in sort of death cult behavior and say, I want to be the last man standing, or we're going to engage in a radical reevaluation of the way we live our lives. And that does not, to me, mean foreclosing on the Bill Gates idea of using technology. But when you start getting into geoengineering, my God, we've already we've opened up Pandora's box 100 times over. Do we want to keep going back to the box and hope that the next time we open Pandora's box, the spirits that come out of it are actually going to make everything okay finally?
JP, I'm going to say something about all of that, because I kind of bounce back and forth, not to say that I'm one way or the other, but I kind of think it's both of these things. And let me explain what I mean. When we think about how we're actually going, because we are going to address these problems, right? You talk about 60, 70% of the fauna dying. You talk about all of these things, right? A lot of people are saying, well, that's it. Civilization collapses. We all die. That's the end of it. Well, I don't really agree with that. Number one, I think that we have evolved to the point, and we have a level of complexity in human civilization that it would survive pretty much any circumstance, right? In some form, whatever form that would look like. But what I think is that these issues will be addressed. Will they be addressed at the right time? Will they be addressed in time? Will they be addressed in the right way? That's right. That's up to us to decide, right? But there are solutions, right? Not all of them are purely technological, Bill Gates blocking out the sun like some benevolent Mr. Burns or something, you know what I mean? But things like reevaluating how we grow crops, right? Why we spend millions of square acres to grow these crops that could be grown indoors hydroponically in other ways, using less land, using less resources, being more efficient, more economical. There's 1,000 different ways. As somebody who has only recently entered the fray of gardening, you know what I mean? There's just like an insane amount of knowledge out there about things that you can do beyond monoculture, mass scale, single, corporate style farming the way that we do in this country and have since the
Yep.
time that you were talking about, the post-war period, right? Where you're not going to need the pesticides, you're not going to
Yep.
need all of these things, and these things will become eliminated as a generation of new farmers supplants a previous one with a different level of consciousness and so forth. So I do try to maintain some level of positivity about these things, that we can transform our agricultural systems, we can transform the way that we pollute our planet or lack thereof, right? So I think these things are possible. What I'm concerned about, though, is at the very same time that those quote unquote fixes will actually sort of lead us down the path of a more eco-fascist future than an egalitarian eco-socialist one, which I would of course envision, right? A lack of resource scarcity, a regreening of the country, a regreening of the planet along some kind of ideological framework of indigenous
Yeah.
stewardship of the land and so forth, regenerating, allowing the earth to regenerate itself when we just stop harming it on a daily basis, things like that. I think all of that is possible, and I don't think it requires billionaires and their massive schemes in order to achieve that necessarily. Can we fix everything? No. If the Great Barrier Reef fucking disappears, can we ever bring it back? No, we can't. But there's all kinds of other things we can do, right? So I guess that's my long-winded way of getting to this question. Is it possible to accept and reckon with the reality of all of these things and simultaneously not end up a cynic in a very dark place?
Um, yes, because I do actually have hope about things like diet. You know, I can I've been a vegetarian for 30 years. And so I remember when I was a outlier, when I was actually, if I mentioned what my dietary preferences, yeah, I was a, it was a joke. It was a source of ridicule. Ha ha ha, funny, funny, funny. You're not one of those people who's going to force me to not eat my hamburger, are you? Da, da, da. But you can see how quickly the American diet itself, at least in the consciousness of popular culture, is changing. As if the diet itself has not actually changed that much. We're still eating a ton of meat. But you could see a horizon in which these things would change, particularly as generational shifts occur. It's a lot of this stuff, you know what gives me hope is the idea that people could actually just do something themselves. Instead of waiting around for big decision makers to do something yourself. It's actually, that's where it's going to have to come from. It's not going to, if we're waiting for the next presidency to come or a future progressive president that's finally going to, instead of having a 50% target in 2030, they're actually going to do something hard and fast to make a rapid change. That's not where the change is going to come from. The change is actually going to come from individuals changing their lifestyles and their habits and changing their attachment to desire in a consumer culture. So is that possible? Yeah, sure, it's possible. I mean, ultimately, I agree with you. I think that we can have fun with science fiction. Is it going to be Logan's Run? Is it going to be Soylent Green? Is it going to be The Matrix? Is it going to be Road Warrior, Mad Max? I mean, there are possible outcomes. I think human beings will persist one way or another. I think the one of the dangers is as these ecological issues become more and more pressing, and as climate change becomes more and more onerous, and as climate migration becomes a bigger and bigger reality, the tendency towards eugenics in human history is going to rear its ugly head. And it's kind of, we've been kind of playing a
We're already
eugenics game.
there.
Yeah, we've been
Yeah, we're
playing
already
it,
there, my man. We're already
you know.
there.
And
Absolutely.
so And I'm not talking about when you say we're already there, clarify. You're not talking about the fact that we had the Nazis. We're talking about right now, and there are,
Right
the
now,
right
today.
right now today, and this COVID thing is itself a little sort of petri dish example of eugenics, and um, and that idea that we have to that we have to preserve what's little left for those of us who are worth having it is going to is sort of an easy switch over for the empire of oil mentality that has dominated this country for the last 75 years.
JP, I don't watch TV much in terms of news, the way that you do. You consume it in the way that, I don't know, some kind of some kind of organism that consumes the
Yes.
toxins on behalf
Yeah.
of the other organisms around it. But I do happen to catch it, every now and then in the morning, like when I'm at the gym or something, and I see Fox News up on the TV, right? And I watch this stuff, and it's it's pretty amazing how quickly the language is shifting, right? Because now, just in the last week, you've noticed a conflation of the immigration issue and the COVID
That's
issue,
right.
right? So now the immigrants are the disease. They are one and the same, right? The humans that are streaming over the border, streaming is probably not that's the word that they would use, but the humans that are trying to come into this country, that they are a literal disease. And I think that's a pretty important step that you have to take in order to sort of be walking the path of eugenics.
Well, what's fascinating about that is that that comes on the heels. I saw that messaging shift as well. And that messaging shift came after an initial messaging shift in which all of a sudden Republicans started to come out about, and I think it's now almost 2 weeks ago. It's close to 2 weeks ago. It was maybe 2 Mondays ago. Maybe, I don't know, 2 weeks ago. Uh, when they started to say, well, maybe you should get vaccinated. And, I finally got vaccinated, and it's important to get vaccinated. And this was because what? Because in red states where Republicans were dominant, particularly Florida and Texas, there was Florida in particular, though, there was a massive upsurge in COVID cases, Delta variants, and people were dying and people were going to the hospitals, happening in Louisiana, for example, Tennessee. And so people were saying, oh, well, look at this incredible shift. All of a sudden, the Republicans are on board with vaccination because their own people are dying. Well, yeah, that's part of it, but also because they don't want COVID to be the story of the next election. That's for sure. But then all of a sudden you get what? Then all of a sudden, well, it's the immigrants that are bringing it in. It's not the fact that our response has been mismanaged. It's not the fact that we basically had COVID denialism as a part of our party. No, it's because of Joe Biden's border crisis and because the weak pansy liberals who are super permissive are letting these typhoid Marys come across the border and they're infecting you. And that's really where the problem is. And so you can see this subtle shift in blame. So once they admit the problem, okay, we're going to admit the problem. Now we've got to find a way to shift the blame. Look at climate change. We're going to deny that climate change is the problem. Oh, now we're going to say, yes, it's a problem, but it's China. It's China. And this is really, this is kind of the perennial problem with American politics and American culture, American society. We are addicted to denial mechanisms. To me, Donald Trump was a living denial mechanism. I want to be in denial of American history, of American reality, of the collapse of American empire. Oh, I want to embrace Donald Trump. We love denial mechanisms. And 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 the Republican Party they've been masters of finding the next message to allow you, the voter, to deny your culpability in your own demise.
And it's only going to get more extreme as you see things like vaccine apartheid globally, where we're talking about booster shots in the United States, and most of the world hasn't had a single shot, and they won't be getting them anytime soon. So you're going to see this question about what does the COVID virus mean as it continues to sort of incubate in various parts of the world, untreated, unvaccinated, while we, Fortress America fully vaccinates itself or what have you, right? So you're again seeing just kind of a glimpse in the context of COVID and vaccines of what's to come with regard to resources, with regard to water, right? Things like that when it's not going to be vaccines, but it's going to be fresh water, right? As hundreds of millions are migrating because of desertification or ocean acidification or sea level rise or any number of those things, or just frequency of hurricanes or whatever,
massive crop failures.
So as sort of COVID and the vaccine is almost this very sick kind of preview.
Absolutely. And oh, by the way, COVID is not the last of these pandemics, I think, that we're going to experience. I mean, we are zoonotic. Let's not go down the zoonotic rabbit hole.
We don't have time to get zoonotic here.
I caught myself there. You know what I mean?
If you guys want me and JP to get zoonotic, you're gonna need to subscribe to CounterPunch Plus. Go to CounterPunch, the website, get yourself a subscription. That was the best segue that I could do using the word zoonotic. JP Sottile is the man. Newsvandal is the website. Go to the Newsvandal website, newsvandal.com. Sign up for the newsletter. Get it delivered every day. It is the best. You will not find, I don't care what your Feedly looks like. I don't care what your social media feeds look like. JP does it for you, and it's the best. Make sure you support him. Support CounterPunch. JP, thanks for coming on, chatting with us as always.
Thank you for indulging me.
Listeners, viewers, thank you again for your continued support, and we will chat again real soon.